Imagine like a 4th century Roman politician just sitting in a basilica in Italy, and he's mapping out this shipping route, a route that goes past the coast of Somalia, over the Hindu Kush, and straight into the pepper markets of southern India.
Right.
I mean, we usually think of the ancient world as this deeply disconnected place, you know? You picture the Roman Empire sort of huddled around the Mediterranean, the Han Dynasty way off in the east, and in between, just a massive expanse of blank space.
Yeah, filled with sea monsters and here be dragons on the map.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this because the stack of historical and patristic research we are looking at for today's deep dive, it basically blows that fragmented map completely apart.
It really does. It's an incredibly persistent historical illusion, honestly. We have this tendency to treat globalization as a purely modern invention. Like human beings only started connecting the dots of the world after, I don't know, the telegraph or the shipping container.
Right, but we are exploring a world where early global supply chains, like the exact same trade routes moving silk and spices and ivory, those functioned as the superhighways for radical new philosophies.
Yes, and our guide for this deep dive is a man who never actually left the Roman Empire himself. Yet he somehow managed to become a master cartographer of a spiritual network that stretched all the way to Kerala, India.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. What we are examining here is not just a geographical curiosity, it's a masterclass in how early global networks operated. We're going to look at how information, theology, and culture traveled across the known world and how ancient people actually synthesized that massive influx of data to make sense of their place in the universe.
So let's start by introducing our unlikely geographer, right? Ambrose of Milan. For a bit of historical grounding, Ambrose served as the Bishop of Milan from 374 to 397 CE, and his origin story in the sources reads a bit like a superhero comic.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this famous legend that when he was an infant, he was sleeping in his cradle, and a swarm of bees landed on his face. They literally crawled in and out of his mouth and left behind a single drop of honey without stinging him.
Which is quite the image.
Yeah. And his father supposedly saw this and declared it an omen, like, my son will possess unparalleled eloquence.
Right, and it's a striking piece of hagiography, a poetic way for later biographers to explain a man who would become one of the most influential voices of the Western Church. But if you strip away the legend, the reality of Ambrose's background is deeply administrative.
Right.
He was born into the highest echelons of Roman aristocracy. His father was the Praetorian prefect of Gaul.
And just to clarify for anyone listening who isn't, up on their Roman governmental tiers, a Praetorian prefect was essentially the highest-ranking civil servant in the empire.
Exactly.
They were the emperor's right hand, managing administration, logistics, law across these massive territories.
Exactly the right context.
Yeah.
So Ambrose was raised in that environment. He was trained in law, in rhetoric, public administration. I mean, he was a bureaucrat, a politician.
Yeah.
He eventually became the governor of Liguria and Emilia, which meant his headquarters were in Milan. He was running the civic machinery of a major imperial hub.
Which is what makes his sudden pivot to religious leadership so crazy. Because the sources outline that in 374, the local bishop of Milan, a guy named Auxentius, he dies. And the city is basically tearing itself apart.
Right. Massive riots.
Yeah, you had these riotous factions arguing over who should replace him. So Ambrose, acting as the governor, steps into the church simply to keep the peace, to prevent a full-blown riot. And suddenly the crowd just turns and starts chanting his name, demanding that he become the next bishop.
And the craziest detail here is that Ambrose wasn't even a baptized Christian yet. He was just a catechumen.
Wait, really? Just a catechumen?
Yeah, being a catechumen meant he was essentially a beginner. He was undergoing instruction in the faith, but had not yet received baptism or full initiation into the church.
Wow.
So to go from an unbaptized political observer to the spiritual leader of one of the most important cities in the empire, it's an astonishing ascent. Within an 8-day period, he was baptized, ordained, and consecrated as bishop.
I just picture this as if, like, a modern corporate logistics executive, someone who spends their days in boardrooms looking at supply chain bottlenecks and shipping manifests, is suddenly drafted to be a major spiritual leader.
That's a great way to look at it.
Because he didn't just leave his past behind, right? He brought that high-level administrative knowledge of global infrastructure right into his theology.
And what's fascinating here is how seamlessly Ambrose repurposed his political intelligence. Because of his aristocratic background, he possessed a level of geopolitical awareness that most theologians simply could not
Yeah,
access.
he had the imperial trade intel.
Precisely. He understood the customs taxes on the Red Sea. He knew how commercial fleets operated in the Indian Ocean. He realized that the physical routes carved out by merchants in search of profit, those were the exact same routes being utilized by missionaries in search of converts.
And that logistical infrastructure first mindset perfectly frames how Ambrose documented what has to be the most ambitious, extreme journey of his era. A journey that honestly felt like a fairy tale to later historians until modern archaeology proved otherwise.
Yes,
We are talking about the mission of the Apostle Thomas to India.
right. And the Thomasine tradition stands out in early Christian history precisely because of its immense geographical scope.
Yeah.
According to a 3rd century text known as the Acts of Thomas, after the events of Pentecost, the apostles divided the known world among themselves to spread their message. The text states that India fell to Judas Thomas by lot.
And looking at the text, Thomas's reaction is incredibly human. I mean, he is absolutely terrified.
Oh, completely.
He pushes back immediately. He claims he has a weak body, he isn't built for travel, and he literally argues, I'm a Hebrew, how am I supposed to go preach to the Indians? He wants absolutely no part of it.
Well, the narrative emphasizes his reluctance to really highlight the perceived danger and alienation of that journey. To force the issue, the text claims Thomas was actually sold as a slave to a merchant.
Wow.
Yeah, and this merchant was working for a specific Indo-Parthian king named Gondophares, who needed a skilled carpenter.
Hmm.
Now, for centuries, modern historians looked at that specific detail and just dismissed it entirely.
Right, because King Gondophares was considered a fictional character, right?
Exactly. They thought he was a convenient literary device invented to give Thomas a royal foil in a faraway land.
But looking at the archaeological data in this stack of research, that assumption got completely demolished. Sometime in the 19th century, researchers literally started digging up ancient coins in northwest India bearing the name of King Gondophares.
Yeah.
He wasn't a myth. He was a real Indo-Parthian ruler in the middle of the 1st century CE. The exact right time, the exact right place. The legend suddenly had hard, verifiable physical proof.
And it profoundly changes how we view these ancient texts. It validates the historical plausibility of the narrative framework. By the 4th century, when Ambrose is writing his commentary, the Enarratio in Psalm 45, the idea that Thomas went to India isn't debated. It's accepted history.
Right.
But Ambrose takes it a step further. He argues that the Pax Romana, the period of relative peace and stability enforced by the Roman military, was actually a providential tool.
How so?
Well, by suppressing piracy and local conflicts, the Roman Empire inadvertently built the geopolitical stability necessary for ideas to travel to the ends of the earth.
And he tracks that travel with stunning precision. I mean, Ambrose doesn't just say Thomas went east. He relies on military and commercial intel. He cites a bishop named Musaeus who traveled towards Central Asia, and a Theban scholar who actually made the oceanic voyage to India.
Yes, the detail is remarkable.
Ambrose records a highly detailed maritime itinerary. They start at the Gulf of Adulis, down in modern-day Eritrea. Then they sail past the promontory of Eremata, which is Cape Cordafui in Somalia,
Right.
down to the Emporium of Troglodytes on the East African coast, past the lands of the Oxymitans, and finally they cross the open ocean to land at the Indian Emporium of Muziris, which is modern Kodungallur in Kerala.
Ambrose is essentially providing a 4th century cartographic snapshot of the maritime spice route. He is laying out the exact ports of call a commercial vessel would take to get from the Roman Red Sea to the lucrative pepper markets of South India.
And if you are listening to this right now and trying to picture the sheer scale of crossing the ancient world, it sounds insane. I mean, Ambrose even mentions barbaric mountains that had to be crossed, likely referring to the Hindu Kush or the Himalayas.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking.
So I have to ask, was Thomas really just hopping on a convenient spice ship, or was this an ancient, extreme survival reality show? I mean, was he dodging death at every turn?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it was certainly perilous. But we must understand the mechanism of ancient trade. This wasn't a rogue, unprecedented journey. The key was the discovery of the monsoon winds.
Right.
Sailors figured out that the Indian Ocean operates on a massive seasonal clock. If a ship left Egypt in July, the summer monsoon winds would basically slingshot them across the open ocean to India in roughly 40 days.
Wow.
They would conduct their trade, wait a few months, and the winter monsoon winds would blow them right back.
So it was like an ancient wind-powered conveyor belt?
Precisely. And the sheer volume of this trade was staggering. We are talking about hundreds of massive commercial ships making this journey from Egypt to South India every single year.
That's incredible.
It is. Early commercial globalization built a reliable physical infrastructure. Thomas didn't just wander blindly off the edge of the map. He followed the most lucrative, heavily trafficked trade winds of the ancient world.
So Thomas eventually arrives at the edge of the known Roman map. But for Ambrose, sitting in Milan, the fascination wasn't just the logistics of how Thomas got there, it was the specific people he found waiting for him at the end of the world.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Ambrose's most extensive text on India, a treatise called De Moribus Brachmanorum, or The Customs of the Indians.
Yes. In this particular treatise, Ambrose focuses intensely on the Brahmins, the priestly and scholarly class of India. And to make them comprehensible to his Roman audience, he recounts a legendary dialogue between Alexander the Great, who represents the ultimate symbol of Western military conquest, and a Brahmin sage named Dendamus.
The dynamic between these two is fascinating because Alexander represents everything Rome values, right? Worldly empire building, endless expansion, taking whatever you want. But Dandamus pushes back with what the text calls the theory of abnegation.
Right.
Can you explain the mechanics of that theory?
So the theory of abnegation is the deliberate rejection of physical comforts and material wealth to achieve ultimate mastery over the mind. When Alexander offers Dandamus immense wealth or, threatens him with death, Dandamus essentially laughs.
Because he doesn't care.
Exactly. Ambrose portrays the Brahmins as living this incredibly austere, simple lifestyle. They are immune to the corrupting influences of luxury because they have mastered their own desires.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Ambrose is making a profound theological argument here. He is saying that this rigorous moral discipline, achieved simply through human reason and nature, meant that the Brahmins were uniquely primed for the spiritual message Thomas brought them.
Yes.
He viewed their way of life as a natural precursor to Christian monasticism. But reading this treatise today, it feels exactly like reading modern social commentary.
How do you mean?
Well, think about how we communicate today. You see this all the time, where a writer or an influencer will point to an idealized version of an exotic or distant culture to critique their own society.
Oh, I see.
Like, someone might write an article praising the extreme minimalism of Scandinavian design or the intense discipline of ancient Stoicism. And it's not necessarily because they want to move to Sweden or ancient Greece, but to shame the rampant materialism and overconsumption of modern culture. It's a rhetorical weapon. Ambrose is using the Brahmins to guilt-trip Rome.
That is a brilliant psychological comparison. Ambrose is absolutely weaponizing the Brahmins as a moral mirror for the Roman elite. It is much easier to critique your neighbor's behavior by pointing to a pristine, unreachable ideal than by simply arguing about local politics.
Yeah.
By elevating the asceticism and moral purity of the Indians, he is silently condemning the immense wealth, the political backstabbing, and the decadent luxury of 4th century Milan and Rome.
He is basically saying, look at these people at the absolute edge of the map. They understand spiritual discipline far better than you do sitting in the capital of the civilized world. But this wasn't just a philosophical thought experiment to make Romans feel bad. It was grounded in a vibrant, living reality over on the Malabar coast of India. The tradition of the St. Thomas Christians in India is incredibly deep, and it perfectly aligns with the geography Ambrose was mapping.
It really does. The living traditions of the St. Thomas Christians maintain that Thomas arrived at Muziris, that exact port Ambrose tracked, in 52 AD. The historical consensus suggests he began his mission by preaching to the Jewish merchant colonies that were already deeply established in these coastal trading centers.
And from those trading centers, the sources detail the founding of the 7 great churches. There are specific traditions like the Thamaparvam or the Songs of Thomas, which are based on ancient oral histories.
Right.
They recount the conversion of 32 Brahmin families, and the cultural integration here is the part that truly stands out. Because these converts didn't just erase their heritage, they kept certain Brahmin customs.
Like wearing the sacred thread.
Yeah, the sacred thread and the kudumi, which is the traditional top knot, they seamlessly blended their social heritage with their new theology.
It represents a remarkable synthesis of ancient cultures. And the material evidence of this thriving community is just as compelling as the written texts. The tradition universally holds that Thomas was ultimately martyred with a spear in 72 AD, and his tomb is venerated at Mylapore, near modern Chennai.
A tomb which Ambrose and his contemporaries definitely knew about and referenced in their writings.
Yes. And as we move a few centuries forward, we see even more incredible physical evidence, like The granite crosses from the 7th century found in South India. These are bas-relief crosses, but they feature inscriptions in Pahlavi.
Which, just to clarify for everyone listening, Pahlavi was the administrative and literary language of the Sasanian Empire over in Persia.
Precisely. So you have a Persian linguistic inscription carved into a Christian cross, which itself is standing on a lotus base, a classic, quintessential Indian artistic motif. It is a literal blending of three distinct worlds carved into granite. It proves that the networks of faith and trade connecting India, Persia, and the broader world remain deeply active long after the apostles' death.
Okay, seeing all this evidence, I have to ask a pointed question. Ambrose is sitting hundreds of miles away in Milan. He's writing about these people, the Brahmins, the tomb of Thomas, the trade routes. So what does this all mean for Ambrose? Like, did he actually care about the Indian Christians as a living community, or were they just a highly convenient political talking point for him to win a massive theological debate back home? Because the sources show he was in the middle of a brutal, high-stakes fight against a movement called Arianism.
This raises an important question about Ambrose's ultimate motivations. And the honest answer is that the theology and the politics were inseparable. Ambrose was deeply embroiled in the Arian crisis, which was an existential threat to Orthodox Christianity at the time.
Let's define the stakes of that crisis for the listener. What exactly were the Arians arguing that had Ambrose so terrified?
So, the Arian movement, named after a presbyter named Arius, taught that Jesus Christ was a created being. Their core slogan was essentially, "There was a time when the Son was not."
Okay.
They believed Christ was subordinate to God the Father, not co-eternal and co-equal. For Ambrose, this wasn't just a minor academic disagreement. If Christ was a created subordinate being, the entire mechanism of human salvation fell apart. Furthermore, many of the Roman emperors at the time leaned toward Arianism.
Right. And if the emperor is Arian and the church is purely a Roman institution, then the emperor gets to dictate theology.
Exactly. Ambrose needed a geopolitical trump card. To defeat the Arian heresy and maintain the independence of the church from the Roman emperor, Ambrose needed to prove that his version of the faith, the one church, was truly universal. It could not just be a Roman club.
So he points to India.
He points to India. The fact that a living, breathing Christian community existed in India, established by an original apostle operating entirely outside of Roman political or military control, was his ultimate proof.
Because it wasn't Roman.
Right. It demonstrated the sovereign power of the Spirit transcending human empires. He utilized the physical geography of the Indian Church to prove that spiritual truth could not be contained by the borders of Rome, and therefore could not be dictated by the political whims of an Arian emperor in Milan.
That is a brilliant, high-stakes, strategic move. He takes the maritime shipping lanes, the monsoon wines, the history of Thomas, the ascetic philosophy of the Brahmins, and the living reality of the South Indian churches, and he synthesizes them all into this undeniable proof that the world is bigger and more profoundly connected than anyone in Rome wanted to admit.
It is a masterful synthesis of global data. Ambrose truly acted as an intellectual bridge to the East for the Western mind. By taking the time to map the ports, to understand the logistics of the trade winds, and to respect the rigorous philosophy of the Indian people, he transformed India from a mythic, fragmented land of dragons into a tangible, vital part of the global human story.
Think about your own digital life for a second. We look at our modern internet feeds, our global supply chains, and we think this level of interconnectedness is entirely unprecedented.
Yeah, we really do.
But the truth is, information and radical ideas have always traveled the spice routes. The next time you feel completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data in our modern global networks, just remember that human beings have been synthesizing massive amounts of global data to understand their place in the universe for millennia. Ambrose was doing it in a basilica in the 4th century.
It is a strangely comforting thought. The human drive to connect, to map the unknown, to synthesize distant information, and to share meaning across vast, dangerous distances is not a new phenomenon. It is deeply embedded in our historical DNA.
Ambrose used the physical geography of Thomas's journey to prove a massive theological point. But there's another text from this era that pushes Thomas's geography even further, not just across the earthly map, but across the cosmic map. And I want to leave you with this final, mind-bending historical legend from our sources. It's from an apocryphal text called the Transitus Mariae, or the Passing of Mary.
An incredibly fascinating and highly symbolic text. And just to define apocryphal in this context for everyone, these were early writings that circulated widely and influenced Christian culture, but were ultimately not included in the official canonical Bible.
Right, so this specific text describes the end of the Virgin Mary's life and her bodily assumption into heaven. But here is the wild part.
Yeah.
The story claims that the Apostle Thomas is miraculously transported from his mission all the way in India to be the sole witness to her assumption. All the other apostles are completely skeptical when he tells them, which is a brilliant, ironic inversion of the classic doubting Thomas story.
It really is.
To prove it to them, Thomas shows them the girdle, the belt that Mary dropped down to him from heaven as she ascended.
It is a powerful, evocative image that actually became very common in medieval art. But the symbolic implication behind the story is what truly resonates with the geographical themes we have unpacked today.
Exactly. Why Thomas? Why did the early church need the apostle who was sent to the absolute farthest, most extreme earthly bounds across the Red Sea, riding the monsoon winds past the barbaric mountains to the shores of Kerala, to be the one who verifies the ultimate heavenly bounds?
It's a profound thought.
I want you to just ponder that cosmic cliffhanger for a bit, because maybe that old fragmented map we talked about at the beginning was right in one very specific sense. Once you push past the edges of the known world, you really do start to touch something beyond it.